Okay, well, I guess that we'll get started. So just don't mind the joining conference noises as we
Joining
go,
conference.
just like that one there. So hello, and thank you for joining the the second Forest Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I'm the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, or the COP, which is run
Joining
by
conference.
OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources located in Sudbury, Ontario. And the agenda for today's webinar is as follows. I will give a short 5-minute introduction, then I'll give the reins over to Dr. Harry Nelson and his colleague Dr. Brad Seeley until around 1:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, after which we will have a 15-minute discussion period. So just a quick reminder before we start, if you haven't done so already, would you kindly dial *6 to mute your phone, as well as mute your computer speakers because we'll be recording the webinar and sometimes we pick up some weird feedback. And also, I just want to bring your attention to the chat function on the left-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions or concerns during the presentation, just use this chat function to send me a quick message if you need an immediate response. Or if you have questions for Harry or Brad, we ask that you please hold them until the end when we have our question and answer period. So before we begin the presentation, I just want to give a quick description of the Community of Practice website for those of you who may not be familiar with it. It's an interactive online community that brings together experts from across Canada who work on climate change adaptation. And the COP, it's a private site and it currently has about 387 members made up of mostly provincial and territorial employees, as well as individuals from other levels of government, academia, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector as well. And then within that larger COP is a sub-community called the Forest Adaptation Community of Practice, which is a private space where people who are working in the forestry fields or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation can come together to share resources and discuss topics of interest. And the site provides a platform that actually enables the sharing of upcoming events and recent publications, news articles, webinar information, and it allows members to pose questions to the entire membership if they need help on a specific topic. And just to mention, the site is entirely free, and all we do is we send out one email per week updating you about the newest posts and events on the site. So if anybody on the line today is currently not a member of the Forest Adaptation COP but are interested in learning more, just please contact me via email, which I put up on the chat box on the left, and I can explain how you can become a member. So one of the more popular features of the Forest Adaptation COP is the monthly webinar series. And Mary-Eve Bono has already confirmed a number of presenters for the beginning of 2012. So just to update everyone on what to expect in the new year, on January 17th, we have Gary Nielsen, who is the Climate Change Project Coordinator for the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. On February 14th, we have Frédéric Doyon from the Quebec Institute of Development of the Deciduous Forest, who will be presenting on combining the impact adaptation and vulnerability adaptation for improving the resilience of forest-dependent communities to climate change. On March 13th, we have Harry Nelson presenting again, this time on managing forest and water under climate change and exploring forest management strategies in the San Jose watershed and BC interior. Then on April 17th, we have Stan Cavalinas, who's with the Alberta Sustainable Resource Development with the Government of Alberta, who will be presenting on vulnerability assessment approaches and adaptation programs in ASRD. And then finally on May 15th, we have Catherine St. Marie, who is the Climate Change Science Coordinator for the Canadian Forest Service, presenting her work on assisted migration. So further information about these webinars will be posted on the Forest Adaptation COP as soon as the information is provided to us. So as you can see, there are many more webinars that are coming up in the next year. We're currently in the midst of trying to confirm even more. So if anyone is interested in presenting their work in a webinar, or if you know of someone who would like to give a webinar, please don't hesitate to contact me. Okay, so with that being said,
Joining conference.
On the line today, we have Dr. Harry Nelson along with his colleague, Dr. Brad Seeley, who have generously donated their time to discuss implementing adaptive forest management under climate change and the Kamloops Future Forest Project. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenters, Dr. Harry Nelson is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, specializing in forest policy and economics. His research interests include institutional arrangements for forest management in Canada, the effect of market and non-market factors on forest sector firms, along with exploring the changing roles of government, industries, and communities in how we manage our forests and public lands. And Dr. Brad Seeley is a research associate in the Forest Sciences Department at UBC. His research interests include the development and application of forest growth models at the stand and landscape scale. And his recent work is focused on simulating the effect of climate change. And their presentation today will review an integrated approach to exploring the development of a complex forest landscape under climate change, ultimately to select adaptation strategies around forest management, using an example from the BC interior. The presentation will show how a suite of models can be used in a collaborative approach as a platform for the evolution of learning and management. So with that introduction, I will turn things over to Harry Nelson and Brad Seeley.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you for taking the time to listen to us today. And as we start with the first slide here, I just want you to take a look at the title and keep this in mind as we walk through this slide. Key word here is implementing adaptive forest management. What we're going to try and show you is how we believe in building these models and using science to build these models actually helps us kind of walk through not only a vulnerability assessment that we're all kind of struggling with as resource managers kind of across Canada and elsewhere, but actually getting to the stage where we can actually
Vous êtes en train de vous joindre à la conférence.
Strategies or
Marie-Ève.
that we think we want to take mitigate those risks or vulnerabilities we're facing, but how we could actually go about doing that. With that, I'll introduce this project. This was a significant research project funded under the BC Future Forest Ecosystem Science Council. And I'm just one of many really on this project.
Joining conference.
I think one of the strengths of this project, as you see from the research team, is it drew from a range of kind of expertise. Not only Brad, who's here with me in terms of ecosystem modelers, but also people like Stuart Cohen, that work in climate change.
Joining conference.
Practitioners. And you'll actually see there's quite a few people in here, I won't point out all their names, that are actually practitioners. And that's really important as we go through this, because we want to make sure that as we're kind of taking the best kind of science
Joining conference.
we have,
Diane.
all these models, ultimately we still end up with something that can kind of speak to those people on the ground that have to basically are going to be implementing, whether it's an alternative regeneration strategy or thinking about maybe revising stocking standards, that just, our results in some ways make sense to kind of inform those decisions that they make. So kind of here's on the overview slide here, we're looking at kind of now the remainder of the presentation. And this is something, really a few kind of a way, another important part of this research is that it's also tied to a particular place. And if we think about climate change and how it's going to impact forest resources, we come to the conclusion or the understanding too, that much of the kind of strategies that we're going to look at are tailored to that particular place as well. So we're going to talk about the area. We're going to talk more generally about the challenges faced in that area. Talk about the fact that this project actually was able to build on kind of pre-existing vulnerability assessments, really help facilitate what we
Joining conference.
Important kind of this research project. And then we're going to talk about some preliminary conclusions from the modeling work we've done here. And I want to take at this point to emphasize too that we are in the process of kind of finalizing this research project. And part of that means that we're in the process of sharing the results with both various decision makers, kind of provincial policymakers, as well as with practitioners. And so you'll see some of our preliminary kind of thoughts, which we're going to be looking for feedback from them. And I anticipate that by January,
Joining conference.
Have our final kind of, recommendations coming out of that. So you're getting kind of a sneak peek kind of with, of what's to come. So we talked about, or I just talked about quickly here, that you need to really understand what kind of adaptation you need to make. You need to understand what could happen in the area you're looking at. And the area that we chose to look at was a kind of subset of a place in the BC interior within the Kamloops timber supply area. And this map here shows you Kamloops sits about 5 hours to the northeast of Vancouver if you're driving. And the area that, the Kamloops timber supply area is about 2.8 million hectares, one of the administrative districts that we use to, of course, in British Columbia. And for reasons we can go into later, we decided to model only a subset of that area, this 900,000 hectares within that timber supply area. And within it, we've got 6 broad eco-units, or 6 basically different types of ecozones. And this is a bit kind of gives you a picture of what these different ecosystems look like. And this is one of the most diverse ecosystems within the province. You have everything from dry grasslands in the upper left-hand corner to ponderosa pine forest, to wetter kind of single spruce forest as you move up on the mountaintop. And that indeed was one of the reasons this area was picked originally to do a vulnerability assessment, simply because the diversity of ecosystems meant that there could be diversity of risks and vulnerabilities that climate change could pose. And that would be one of the things we could learn from doing this kind of modeling. The challenge? Well, many of you have had to sit through or think about through these things. We know that climate change is going to pose significant risks to the ecological and social values we expect from our forests. That means we need then to think through, or what about the impact? How is climate change going to impact that forest? In this case, that wetter Engelmann spruce forest, or that drier transition pine forest, or ponderosa pine forest. What then are the vulnerabilities? In this case, if we've got caribou habitat or a particular type of winter range, or we have forests next to communities, risk of fires, what are the vulnerabilities? And finally, once we've been able to sort all that out, what are our management options? And then which ones should we pick? And here, again, we need to be able to kind of take all those possibilities and then kind of start to systematically sort through them, come up with what we actually think or we do want to do. So this slide kind of is the summary of what we are doing in this project. And it's termed K2 here, because it's the second phase of what was kind of a larger kind of effort that was initiated about 5 years ago, under the Kamloops Future Forest Strategy, which we in the project call K1. Under K1, a group of consultants, Ken Zilke and Bryce Bancroft, who are also involved in our project, undertook an expert-led vulnerability assessment of how climate change could impact the broader Kamloops supply area. This looked at the possible risks and then came up with a list of possible options as to what you might be able to do and to mitigate those vulnerabilities. At the end of it, you had a kind of a menu of what we could do, and K2 then became kind of the additional add-on or extension of that initial vulnerability assessment to use modeling to basically explore the expert assumptions about how climate change could impact those forests and those forest values there. Using models as well to identify different adaptation strategies and what effect they would have. Robust there means that the idea is we can evaluate these strategies under different climate scenarios, see how well they do. They perform well under some climate scenarios, not others. And ultimately to provide direction for future forest management planning. The approach here talks about a client-driven, scenario-based modeling, and what that basically means is you've got people, whether they're consulting foresters, licensees, district staff there, working from the beginning, tell you what are the issues there, the values or concerns they have, and then they work, as they work with you, they understand how the models are built, and you also are building the model in a way to be able to help answer those questions. And the scenario-based part of this comes from the fact that, we're using the best science that we have, see that in a few slides, to construct these different scenarios of what possible outcomes could look like under different climate futures, different management scenarios. And this climate change integrated meta model suite simply refers to the fact that in order to be able to do that, we need to link a bunch of different models together to paint a relatively, I wouldn't call it comprehensive, but at least a picture that gives us enough information at the different scales to be a somewhat realistic representation of what's happening as climate changes and how that influences all the different processes working not only at the tree level, but also the sand level and at the landscape level. So this slide here briefly speaks to K1. In it, the approach that was used, which is still being used, is this kind of climate envelope mapping, which many of you may be familiar about. And what that did was that we'll look, we look at these possible climate futures, look at what a future climate might look like, and so what looks like it might be ponderosa pine, in this case, was going, or a pine forest, Kamloops area is going to be going to bunch grass. And then that then was a way to get people thinking about, well, what might happen to the forest there, and we'll see some examples of that throughout the remainder of the presentation, and what might we do. One of the challenges, though, in using this climate envelope mapping approach is it doesn't
Joining
allow
conference.
about how forests or stands may evolve under a changing climate. And we also know that those particular forests aren't all of a sudden going to be wiped, slate's not going to be wiped clean, and what currently was spruce or a pine forest all of a sudden becomes bunch grass. There's going to be trees there, and we need to understand what's going to be happening to those trees as climate changes around them. And our approach allows you to look at that, allows you to look at how those stands are being affected, also allows you to look at how basically stands may change in their structure and their composition as they develop under a changing climate. And this slide here, Kamloops Future Forest Strategy K1, K2, gives you the links between this earlier effort, K1, and how it then fed into K2. And one of the goals in this project, too, was to look at if the models, how well expert opinion and climate envelope map did in terms of predicting or suggesting what could happen. So here in this slide, we talk about what is the purpose of modeling. And this is important because in going out and talking to practitioners and decision makers, there can be a degree of skepticism about models and what the value of models are. And you need to be able to show what the value is in terms of how these can be used to help them in their decision making. We make the case here that we know that climate change is going to introduce uncertainty, but we still have a lot of knowledge about how forests and how species respond to different climatic factors, that we can use these to kind of at least start to limit the bounds, or at least establish maybe some bounds of uncertainty. And throughout the rest of this, as Brad starts to speak to this, you'll see how we've implemented that through developing or using these process-based models that allow us to kind of plug climate into it, and then that enables us then to kind of, in some ways, run these time machines, simulating how climate, what the outcome under different climate and management scenarios are for the study area that we're looking at in the Kamloops timber supply area. One of the outcomes of doing this modeling approach is not only does it give us these specific outcomes, these different scenarios, it also forces us in a structured way to think about important issues such as how to represent mortality. And we'll see that a little bit later in the presentation. It also ties back to having models that make predictions, allows us to monitor things, seeing if what's happening is what we predicted, learning how we can improve the models, and updating those models, those predictions, in this kind of iterative loop, which is important to adaptive management. And finally, this is one of the challenges they found in K1. You start thinking about the complexity of all the things going on in a forest ecosystem, all the different values, and you say, well, what if we want to try and change something here? What if we want to change a planning strategy? It's hard to systematically think through what that means at the landscape level across all those other values. And this modeling approach basically helps us do that. And at the end of the day, the goal is to end up with a set of outcomes and information that help decision makers basically prioritize actions, identify what risks that they want to respond to, and both at the policy level down to the operational level, what particular new strategies we'll want to adopt to address those vulnerabilities, what we think looks most promising given we've gone through this kind of rigorous kind of evaluation process. And at this point, I'm going to let Brad speak to the slide with all the different models. The only thing I would say here is, much like you saw a lot of people, there's a lot of models there, but that's kind of necessary to basically build that picture we need to of how climate's going to impact these forests. Brad?
All right. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I'll take you through this modeling suite here without going into excruciating detail. But basically, what we've done here is we've tried to deal with the issue at different spatial scales. And so if you start up kind of in the upper left-hand corner, we're dealing with stand level there. And we deal with, we've got our changing climate conditions from the GCM models and downscale data. We've got our inventory data in the terrain, and we've separated that out into 21 different stand units and 6 different climate regions essentially within this broader land base. We've got the 4-weighting model, which is actually a sub-model in the forecast model, and it allows it to look at stand-level hydrological dynamics at a daily concept. And particularly, it's related to the stimulation of water stress, which is important for growth and mortality. There's also the TACA model, which we'll get into in a little bit, but that deals with regeneration success and how it might change over time, different climate strategies and so on. And then we've got the forecast climate model, which then takes the input from the TACA with respect to regeneration, and it considers the temperature and water stress data, and then projects how these different stand units may grow in the future under different climate scenarios. And it produces a suite of attribute curves you can see on the far right there, which include things such as your standard kind of growth and yield outputs, snags and coarse-weed debris, and some other indices of stress and mortality that are then used as a database that links to the different landscape level models that we use. So we use 2 different landscape level models in this project. One called FPS Atlas, which is your kind of a more standard forest planning type model. We did that one so we could kind of make it more realistic in terms of forest planning exercises. Then we also used a different model, which is a spatially explicit model, which uses a raster-based approach to look at some of the issues around the spatial dynamics of natural disturbance regimes that might develop under climate change. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to do here was to test some of the assumptions that came from the K1 exercise. And we wanted to look at those across several eco-groups. We wanted to look at what the implications might be for increasing fire disturbance, increasing insect disturbance, increasing drought. And we were particularly interested in things around habitat and biodiversity, and we had people in the project, Lori Kremsetter, for example, that were looking at that aspect and trying to link it back to things such as old growth management areas and how they might be affected by fire regimes that are changing. And then at the stand level, looking at the development of stand structure under different kinds of climate. And so we had several indicators that were then assigned to these particular values. And for example, in this habitat and biodiversity value, we had 8 different indicators that we were looking at around. Okay, so in terms of the climate data here, we started off with several different GCM models that were and scenarios that were kind of the byproduct of a larger group that were involved with these different climate change projects within BC. And we identified some that we'd like to represent in this analysis. And of course, you always start off with more than you can actually do in the end. But in the end, we focused on kind of a high change scenario, which we call the A1, or it's the A1B1 emission scenario, the HAD-GEM model. And we think this one represents kind of a reasonable change scenario, although it looks, with the way things are going, that this might even underestimate what's going to happen in the future. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that we then use the output from this model in combination with local data from different climate stations. Remember, we had these different eco groups, and we had 6 different eco groups, and then we had representative climate stations from each of these eco groups, each one having 30 years worth of daily data that we then used to downscale the climate change data from the GCMs into daily data. And you can just see some of the examples there going across there. So we use a combination of the 2020s, the 2050s, and the 2080s output to construct sort of a trajectory of change. And if you look at some of these trajectories here, you can see that there's these kind of oscillations there, and some of that shows just the historical sort of PDO oscillations that you see going forward. Okay, so those were the data then we used to drive the model. Okay, so talking about the TACA model, this was a model developed by Dr. Craig Nitschke at BC, and now he's at the University of Melbourne. And it's a model that focuses on this whole regeneration and establishment phase. And essentially, it looks at all the different species that are involved here, and it draws on their genealogical aspects in terms of how they interact with climate, such as frost events and degree day accumulations, things like that. And what it does then is it takes all these things into consideration, and then it looks at the probability of certain types of climate years the probability that they will occur. And these probabilities come from sampling of the historical data. So he'll take like 50 years of historical data and then look at the probability of these different types of climate years occurring, and then he'll use the climate change data to project what that might be piggybacked on that natural sort of variability in the climate. And then he'll project that forward under these different ones and comes up with a probability of establishment for the different tree species. Here's an example of some output. So up in the top table there, we have the assumptions that came from the K1 analysis. So in this particular example, we're looking at the dry IDF-DK eco group, which is the higher elevation sort of drier side of that group. And we're looking at it's a group that tends to be dominated by lodgepole pine. It represents about 28% of the area in the project. And it was identified to be an area with high ecological sensitivity. And so if you look at the bottom table here, what he's done is he's stratified the area into different soil groups ranging from, based on their moisture status, going from xeric to hygric. And then the output of the model shows basically this kind of discrete categorization here, whether the lodgepole pine will establish in these different soil types under the current climate, then going into the 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s. And so what you can see there is that currently pine is able to establish in most of these sites, but as the climate gets warmer and drier, the model is predicting that it's going to become less and less frequent in terms of a naturally regenerated species. So that's information that then goes into the forecast climate model and some of the other outputs here. Okay, so the other model I wanted to talk to you about was the forecast climate model. And forecast is a model that's been around for more than 20 years, developed by Dr. Hamish Kim and others. And what this is it's an extension of that forecast model to allow it to incorporate daily climate data, including temperature and precipitation data. And then that provides a feedback on both the growth rates of trees and understory vegetation through the water stress and temperature effects on growth. But it also has an influence on decomposition of dead organic matter, and that's important for the nutrient supply, which then can also feedback net primary productivity. So in this approach, we're really trying to get away or go beyond the climate envelope approach and start to look at some of the interactions that might happen between tree species, between site conditions such as soil factors and different tree species, and try to get a little bit more into the details of what's happening there. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, there's a number of climate scenarios that we could have explored, but we had to put it down to something that was doable here. So what we've done here is, and some of the output I'll show you, is we looked at a no climate change with what we call the business as usual scenario. That's just the different kinds of management scenarios that are going on currently as business as usual. And so we've represented trees that are currently planted and so on. And then we have a high climate change scenario where we take that climate change data and we use the same planting options just to see what the impacts of the climate would be using the same management approach. And then we did a third one where we looked at some of the cases where there was poor performance or stress developing and so on. So we came up with some alternative regeneration options that could then be evaluated as they develop over the landscape in the long term through the modeling framework. Okay, so as part of the project, we wanted to bring in some confidence in the model's projections. And so in the first year of the project, this was a 2-year project, we established a number of sites that we then used to evaluate the model performance and calibrate its outcome. So we used the dendroclimatology approach, and so we established 12 sites in the IDF-DK and the ICH-MW, and we focused on 2 tree species that are important from a timber and other values perspective in that region, lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. And we wanted to focus on trees that were sort of in that young to mature stage, ones that would be actively contributing to the volume production within the site. So in these 12 sites, we sampled or we cut down 20 trees on the site and took cookies from them. And then those cookies were sent to the tree ring lab at UNBC for analysis. And then we looked at the tree ring data. Use that as a way to validate the model projection. Okay, so when if we focused on the area and the time from 1975 to 2004, this was when this was a period of time where we had good climate data, and we look at the ring width indices from the dendro data and compare that to the sapwood production. You see that from these things we found that the model was performing quite well in terms of projecting when the good years were and when the poor growth years are. I'll just draw your attention to the slide the graph on the upper right. This was a site where we didn't find very good relationship, and when we went back to look at that more carefully, what happened there was a big Douglas fir bark beetle outbreak right in the middle of the chronicity that essentially damped the climate signal. But for the most part, this gave us confidence that the model is performing well. Okay, I'm going to try to go. I see we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have to go through these fairly quickly. So what this shows is water stress predicted by the model, and the red line is the climate change scenario, and the blue line is the historic climate data. And there's 2 things going on here. One is you see the stress goes up until about year 35. That's because as the canopy develops, it's putting more pressure on the site to provide water resource. And then the other thing to notice is that under the drier, warmer climate change scenario, there's a substantial increase in water stress in this particular zone. This is a dry Douglas fir around 1,000 meters elevation. Okay, next slide. Okay, there's more than just water stress affecting growth. There's also the temperature effect here. Now remember, this is a high elevation site, and so you're seeing with climate change a warming, and you have essentially what's happening is the growing season is actually expanding in length with the spring being warmer and the fall being warmer. So what you see in this graph is a climate growth response index, which you look at the zero axis, that indicates kind of an average year. And you can kind of think of these as almost as like tree rings here. And so what this shows is that the climate change year is actually growing better than the no climate change year. And that's because despite the negative feedback in the summer from the water stress, the increase in the growing season length is more than offsetting that. And we're seeing actually better growth with the climate change scenario, although the trees are stressed. Okay, thanks. This is just a quick graph to look at. For this particular stand type, if we look at the no climate change scenario, the blue line, and then we compare it to stands established in the 2020s, 2050s, or 2080s, you can see that the volume production is actually going up, as I indicated from the last graph. And there is more mortality and there's more tree stress going on here. So I wanted to stress that we don't know for certain that these trees aren't going to be hit by some sort of insect attack or other agent of disturbance because they are more stressed. But the mortality that we do represent from water stress wasn't enough to offset that increased growth. The other thing that's going on here, just quickly, is that there's a positive feedback from the increased decomposition that we see on this site, and it's showed with the red versus the blue again. And this increased decomposition is giving an increase in the available nutrients. That's also providing a feedback here. So this is one of the few approaches where we look at the interaction between the soil and the tree in terms of projecting growth. Okay, let's skip this one. Okay, so I did make reference to mortality there. You saw that in those that the stress was going up. And one of the things we did at the start is we knew that mortality was going to be a difficult thing to represent. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do this. And one of the things we did is we looked at data from the district on when these mortality events were occurring, and we compared it to the water stress values that we were seeing, and we found a good correlation with some types of mortality agents and with others not. And so we came up with a stress threshold, and when the trees had a certain amount of stress, then they had a X amount of mortality. And we compared that. We sort of used the historic data to help calibrate that. Again, I don't have enough time to go into all that. Next slide. But we also looked into the literature and talked with experts about what that kind of stress might be. But one of the findings we wanted to that we'll stress here is that that we'll look at is that stress is definitely going up in these ecosystems, even though productivity might be going up. That there is this concern that this higher level of stress might account for, might lead to a greater vulnerability to other kinds of agents of disturbance. And this just shows it's the same curves that we looked at before. That's just showing the number of snags that are accumulating over time to show that there is greater mortality happening scenarios. And this was strictly mortality based on water stress. Okay, so we also looked at, we took these stand level attributes and extrapolated them up to the landscape using the forest planning studio approach. And we were able to then project feedback on landscape outputs on just the degree to which stress is occurring, species changes, harvest levels and growing stocks and dead and down trees and so on. Okay, so as you can imagine, there's just massive amounts of output from this project. And so we're only going to show you just a few things here, just to kind of give you a flavor of what's going on. One of the outcomes we found is that I showed you in the previous example with the stand level that in some cases the stand level model was showing that the climate was actually increasing growth, and in other cases in the lower elevation sites where it was drier, we found decreased growth. In some cases it didn't change that much. But the impact was that over the total landscape, if you look at the graph on the left, this is cumulative harvest volume over the 100-year period. You can see that there's not much difference between the scenarios there. It only starts to show a difference in the long term as the increased disturbance under the high climate change scenario starts to kick in and also we start to see some of the regenerated stands not doing as well in that area. Another interesting output, as I mentioned before, is just the amount of area in stress. If we look at the graph on the right, this is just for one particular forest type, the dry transitional. You see that the total area in stress stands has gone up dramatically from just a few hundred hectares to more than 35,000 hectares of stressed trees on the landscape. So that's another interesting outcome. Let's just skip this one. Okay, so we also looked at the Dynaplan model, and one of the things we dealt with here is we focused on it. We tried to get a more realistic representation of fire that might be going on, and we looked at the different kinds of fuels and fire spread algorithms based on standard kind of fire models. And we ran several simulations here using fire rate or fire regime changes based on a study that was done by Craig Nitschke and his PhD, which showed how different rates of change in the climate would affect air spread and intensity of fire. And what we found was when you go through these simulations, the landscape was going from a more mature landscape to a much younger landscape based on all this fire activity that was going on. There was also, we can also look at oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, sorry, the previous one showed species, so we can look at species changes, and then the next one shows the age class changes, and that has implications for biodiversity and old growth habitat and attributes at the stand and landscape scale. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Harry there. So I apologize for going through that so quickly, but it's just a lot of information.
So now we've got about 2 or 3 slides to wrap up, and as I explained earlier, we really are in the process of sorting through all these reams of output and interpreting them along with the various folks that are going to use these. And I guess these are some kind of preliminary conclusions that we've got. And we've kind of, in some ways, been bringing these out there to see how the people we're working with respond to them. We do see the value in doing this modeling approach that kind of extends these kind of vulnerability assessments. At least to date, people are finding value in letting them explore, go deeper into these kind of options or these questions about what you might do, what kind of risks you might actually have out there, either at the sand level or at the landscape level. Some examples that we've discussed kind of throughout this presentation is some things you don't necessarily expect, which is we didn't see necessarily negative effects on productivity. In fact, we saw it increasing in some parts of the forest, but we did see this significant increase in the amount of risk. You can also see there was a little gremlin that got in there. We didn't have any elves working on the project, but one of the values of that meant to be different model levels means that because we have kind of both regeneration models, sand models, as well as the landscape models, that gives you some of the questions you face are at different scale, and that lets you kind of test it. So you don't have to actually go and necessarily rule out what it means to put ponderosa pine all across the landscape, but you can test it to see when will it start doing well. What are the trade-offs in terms, perhaps, of giving enough pine volume now, but potentially improving other species volume growth. Apologize for the last one being cut off, but in our view, as we go through this, we find it hard to get away from the conclusion that you need some kind of sand level modeling that's got to be able to account for the changing climate. Otherwise, it's just you're just working with something that is just not adapted and not capable of representing what could happen there. One of the $64 million questions here is this issue of mortality and stress. And I think one of the kind of working conclusions we're coming from is either we don't necessarily know now how the stress that we're seeing in our models may necessarily lead to mortality. At least it gives us a place to start to try to understand that relationship. which may better inform or help us develop better predictors of these risks and vulnerabilities down the road. And then finally, I'd say that already in this project, as we've had these kind of iterations among all the various people working within the project, as well, we've now started to kind of work again with the practitioners and the decision makers. That does create additional learning above and beyond it. We've already seen in the course of the 2 years we've been working on this project how we've been able to improve the models, how the models better speak to what the issues are, and where we see some of the next steps following if we were able to continue this or somebody else was going to be able to continue. Unfortunately, one of the bigger questions, and I know this is a challenge for provincial governments across the country, is we had to pull together a fairly diverse set of experts and expertise to be able to do this. Easier to do it again the next time around because hard parts always build these kind of things. But it's a challenge going forward. If we don't really have these kind of models or these kind of teams in place, that's a challenge to try and replicate it elsewhere. Can't say that we have any answers to that, but just simply note that even though this does bring value, we understand too that it's not something that's necessarily easy to kind of to do. And with that, I've gone a few minutes over, but I'd like to thank you. And as I said, there's a lot more information there, and I would turn your attention towards the website here that, as you can see, will give you various papers, background notes on the different models, the outputs today, and we welcome any questions, both following this presentation, or you can also reach us through the website, or you can always email me as well to harry.nelson@ubc.ca. Thank you for your time, and happy to try and answer any questions.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect, great, thank you guys. So now the floor is open for questions. If you want to unmute your phone, you can do it that way. Or if you would like to type your question, you can type it in the chat box. So we'll give you a few seconds here. Are there no questions? Anyone? Okay. Well, I guess you answered all their questions in your presentation.
Like I have to say, we just did this last week in Victoria too, and I think part of the challenges we face in this is there's a lot there, and trying to kind of put in ways that become approachable for people. We had a lot of
Detailed questions of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I realize some of this is still geared towards very BC specific kind of acronym dialogue too.
Okay.
Well, as I said, we're happy to. Please feel free to contact myself or any one of us or the website, and happy to share with you our thoughts or anything else we can answer any questions you might have. And as I said, over December and January, you can look to the website as well to start seeing these final reports coming out, which will kind of get down to some of the recommendations and showing you how we got there.
Okay, so I guess that's it for today. For all of you on the line right now, please remember if you just contact me if you'd like more information on the FACoP website, and if you have any suggestions for future webinars. And please note that we will be posting a discussion forum on the FACoP for any members wishing to ask any further questions or converse with each other in that sense. So also a recording will be available on the site shortly as well. So thank you again to Harry and Brad for your presentation, and have a great week.